Doing the reviews and the Jeopardy. Which side won, by the way? Jeopardy. This side? This side. Was it 3 groups or 2? 2? Addison won? All right,
Pretty much.
Well, what is that? We are not done reviewing. There are some things, so what I did this week is I thought, okay, can I boil down Genesis 1 and all that we covered in the last few months into just like a few points? And I narrowed it down to 7. I thought that'd be fitting. So 7 points that I want us to remember. So we're going to just do another review before we take a step forward. Today's is going to be different. It's not going to be a normal sermon. This is going to be a little bit of more teaching than preaching, discovering more about how the Bible works and how to read it before we go into the next chapter, Genesis chapter 2. Because there's some things that I kind of want to prime us for as we delve into more narrative in the Bible, okay? But before we do that, I want to make sure that we have some things really locked in. The Psalm 1 says, blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the way of sinners, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, who meditates on the law day and night. And so this is what we do. When we review, and I like taking it in different ways, whether it's like a Jeopardy game or taking lots of questions and stuff, but just different ways to review and make sure that these concepts stick with us. Because they're going to show up over and over again. These are the key foundations so much for understanding the rest of the Bible, really understanding what God is up to in the world. So, I'm not going to just give you those 7 points. I'm going to have us go through a journey together. So you can close your eyes if you'd like, but this is sort of a memory palace, if you will, of these 7 steps. So if this helps you, great. If it doesn't, I'll try not to make it too long. So imagine you're an astronaut out in space, but your spaceship is crashing, and it is not working. You do everything, you hit all the buttons, it's not working. And you crash land on the moon. And your ship is in ruins. And you are on the dark side of the moon, and you're wondering if anyone's going to find you. And you kind of, stumble through all your stuff. You can't really see anything because it's dark. But you come across this one little origami crane, and you hold that up, and this is the last thing that you can really know is there. And some time goes by, and it turns out to be 7 a.m., but because you're on the dark side of the moon, the sun doesn't come up, but you do see something out in the distance. At 7 a.m., you see an image. You see this lit up flag. And the flag looks kind of like American, but it's really different. It's not the U.S. flag. It actually kind of looks like a mixture of U.S. and all these other countries. And you realize that they have come to rescue you. That all the nations unify together to rescue you from the moon. And you're saved and you're good. And that's the story, okay? So here are the 7 points. 7 points are space, the different spaces. You're an astronaut in space. We talk about this over and over again. You guys know the 3 spaces. There's heaven, earth, and the seas, which is God's space, our space, and nobody's space, the chaos waters. So that's the first thing I want us to really hold on to. So our space, our spaceship crashes, so it's ruined. We talked about this. This was a little more abstract idea. This was a little tougher, but we talked about verse 2. Genesis 1, verse 2. The earth was tohu vabohu, which gets translated in different ways. Formless and void or wild and wasteland. It's this idea that there's chaos, but it's also empty. And this was the way that the Bible described pre-creation. Not, when I think of pre-creation, and in my mind, I think of like a blank canvas. But when the Bible gives an idea of pre-creation, the idea isn't a blank canvas, it's a city in ruins. So we spent a whole week on Jeremiah 4 and the destruction of Jerusalem. And at the end of Jeremiah 4, it describes it as tohu vavohu. So that just gives so much more meaning to the picture of creation, is that God isn't just taking a blank canvas and painting on it, but God is, in some ways, the thinkers of the Bible, the writers of the Bible, thought of it as the destroyed city, in a sense, and how God is bringing life from that destruction. So we've got space, we've got ruins, and then we're on the dark side of the moon, darkness. Darkness was one of the obstacles. And throughout the story of Genesis 1, there's all these obstacles. There's darkness, there's the waters, there's the sea dragon. And it's really good for us to continue to meditate on, how does God deal with the darkness? He doesn't get rid of it. Really strange. You would think that God would destroy the darkness. Why does he let the sea dragon stay there? Why doesn't he slay the sea dragon? And so that shows us a bit of who God is that God is the God who bends these obstacles for his purposes. That God allows the darkness to stay in existence, but then what does he do on day one? He uses the darkness to work with the light, to bring day and night and seasons and signs and all these different things. So he's using it to bring order. So I think that just speaks so well into who God is and how God deals with the darkness in our lives. So darkness, so we've got space, ruins, darkness, origami, the crane. We talked about how it's all structured in a way where you can fold it vertically, you can fold it horizontally, and all these show the different connections between the different days and how it's really ordered these days are. And in particular, if you look at the origami of days 1 through 6, you see how much it's also telling us about what it means to be human. Because then if you do the folds, you can see how humanity, the creation of humanity, aligns with the creation of the trees. And how it also aligns with the creation of the rulers above. And so we're the rulers below. So the origami is something I want you guys to remember. There's origami, and then what do we got? The other S, the 7. So 7 o'clock in the morning. 7 is permeating throughout the whole story of Genesis 1, leading up to the 7th day rest, which seems to be the sign of something more that we're anticipating. This 7th day rest, that's so much more than just a vacation. It's about a release from imprisonment and slavery. There's so much more there. So 7, and then we see an image, so the flag being an image. So we're made in the image of God to represent God, to reproduce, and then, that's making babies, but it's also bringing abundance in the world in any way. So be fruitful and multiply. And then to rule. We were made to rule over creation. So in the image of God, something that's really important for us to take with us. And then the last step there was that the flag that was all these different countries, they were unified. Well, the story of the Bible is all about the unifying of heaven and earth. That's the story, that's the message of Jesus, is that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that the kingdom of heaven is invading the earth. And so we see heaven and earth at the very start. Jesus was all about heaven coming down to earth. Okay? So those are the 7. I'm going to give you one more pneumatic device, and then we'll keep going. So here's the one that helps me a bit. It's going to be ridiculous. Sir, do, see you. Sir, do, see you. Say that with me. Sir, do, see you. Again. Sir, do, see you. So SR, sir. So spaces, ruins. Do is darkness. O is origami. C is SI. So 7 and image. And then U is unified. Heaven and earth. Sir, do, see you. We'll do it some more. You guys, we'll be good. Okay, so let's talk about Genesis. Let's talk about how we understand the Bible. I'm going to give 4 different images that come straight from Tim Mackey. He does just an amazing job of making sense of some of these concepts that you're going to be like, how did I think I understood the Bible before this? Some of these are so critical to understanding how the Bible fits together, what is the Bible trying to do. And so I'm really excited. So this is just going to be the 4 images that I'll show you, and then that will be it. So the first one, as this is getting pulled up, is you're going to see a picture of the Mona Lisa. And the idea here is that people from all over the world come to see the Mona Lisa. They will wait in line for hours. They will do all that they can. They will spend money to travel out to see the Mona Lisa. And it's interesting, you see all the phones. Once you can see people have their phones out there taking pictures of the painting. But I want you to think about this. The Mona Lisa, painted what, about 500 years ago? The reasons that people go to see the Mona Lisa today is not the same as why they would go to see it 500 years ago. Why do you think people might see the Mona Lisa today? Maybe they're history buffs. They love the history of this painting and what's meant over the years, or Da Vinci. Maybe they're art enthusiasts, and there's a certain style of painting that they wanted to see up close. But that's not everybody. Some people may be conspiracy theorists, and they want to see for themselves because they think that's not the original. It's been stolen at some point. Maybe they made a bet and somebody said, I bet you can't stare at the thing for 3 hours straight. I mean, there are just as many people here. Everybody here might have a different reason for seeing the painting. They might take something differently from the painting. And that's how we treat the Bible, right? We all read the Bible and we read it for different reasons. Some of us, it's devotional, it's to give us a little bit of vitamin D for our day. Some of us, it's because of tradition, we just get used to it. And some of us, we can read the same text. And it seems like we're all getting something a little different from it. And so, one of the jobs of biblical interpretation is to think, what was the way that people saw the Mona Lisa 500 years ago? You got to do some time travel to understand the Bible. We don't want to just say, what does the Bible mean for me today? But you want to say, well, why was this story put here to begin with? And there's 2 different time periods that we really are really concerned with. One is when the Bible was written. So it was written to a certain audience for a certain reason. So when the Old Testament was compiled together, there was a purpose for that. Why did the writer of the Bible arrange these stories in such a way for that audience then? So the phrase is authorial intent, or author's intent. What was the intention of the author when they wrote it and when they organized it? But the other time period that we're really interested and concerned with is a few years later when Jesus is reading the Bible. Because, if you want to turn with me to Luke 24. Luke 24, Jesus had just rose from the dead. He had appeared to a couple disciples. Now he's showing up to more disciples. We'll start in verse 42. So Luke 24, 42. They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate before them. So this is resurrected Jesus, he ate, which is a good sign, so that when we have our own resurrection, it seems like we can still eat. That's good. 44, then he said to them, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Okay, two things I want you to get from that. One is that when Jesus referred to the Old Testament, he called it the book of the Law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. So when we look at the Old Testament, we can see it in three different parts, which is sometimes called the Tanakh, which is an abbreviation for the Torah, the Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. So three different parts. Jesus saw the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, as his Bible. He saw something really special about it. He saw the Bible as something sacred. If you're ever, have someone question you, why do you believe the Bible? Well, you could say, because Jesus believed the Bible. I follow Jesus. And Jesus saw something in it. And he saw that it was really important. And so when he's having his little fish dinner, after being raised from the dead, he's talking about the Bible. The other thing is, what did he say about the Tanakh? The Law of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms. What did he say about that? One thing he really wanted to say was that it's all about him. It's all about Jesus. All of this is pointing to Jesus. So even Genesis chapter 1 is going to be pointing to Jesus in some way. It may be presenting a problem that only Jesus can solve. It may be giving some sort of slot that Jesus can step into. Giving some sort of profile or some sort of role that is for Jesus to do. And so when we go into Genesis 2, guess what? It's all about Jesus. And so a part of the challenge we're given as we read the Old Testament is to try to find, where is Jesus in this? What would Jesus have said if you were sitting down eating fish with Jesus and he pulled out Genesis 2 and said, Jesus, I don't see your name here. What would Jesus say about Genesis 2? And saying that it was all about him. So we want to look at, and this is something we did in seminary a lot. And some theologians really argue about how much you should emphasize one or the other. Some will say, any good sermon is going to just go straight to Jesus. Others will say, no, you really want to read those texts, especially in the Old Testament, for what they are at their time. And so what we're going to try to do is both. We're going to try to say, before Jesus, how did they understand the story? Why did the story mean something to them? What was the original author trying to communicate? And we want to say, what would Jesus have said about this text and this story? So we look at the Mona Lisa, and so we want to see the Mona Lisa like we would have seen it 500 years ago. So this is the first one. Mona Lisa, author's intent. What do we have here? What is this? Sorry? Guys, it's so quiet. My hearing, I tell you, I've been listening to cries in my ears all week. I can't hear a thing. What do we see here? A quilt. Yes, that's your question. Okay, so quilt. In this quilt, we might have generations all sewn together. So each individual piece was probably not made at the same time. But somebody took those pieces and put them together in a certain arrangement with certain patterns to give a certain design. And it's the same way with the Bible. So this blew my mind when I first heard this. This is a really accurate picture of how we got the Bible that we have today. So, what had happened, most likely, when it comes to the Old Testament, is we probably had a group of people who weren't at the center of society. Tim Mackey likes to call it a minority report, because you see a lot of what the Old Testament is doing is criticizing the leaders of Israel. And so it's not coming from the leaders of Israel most of the time. Sometimes, we get Bible verses from David, King David, but other times it's this prophet that nobody listened to and nobody believed until what he said years later came true. And so we get all this collection, and we've got the story where Israel comes out of slavery into the promised land. We've got the time of the judges, the time of the kings, then the time of exile, where Babylon and Assyria come, take them over, and then there's a little time of post-exile, where they're allowed to be back at their land, but it's just not the same. And so most scholars would say that our Old Testament was written during the time of post-exile. But it was written like this. So a lot of the collections and the pieces were there, and people decided to pull them together and to arrange them in a certain way to say something important for that generation to know. So we're talking like 400 years before Jesus came, that all these pieces were put together. And so by the time of Jesus, there was a unified quilt called the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim. And so this is really helpful for us. Some people, this is kind of scandalizing. This is kind of hard to swallow because we have in our minds that the Bible is just kind of, floated down from heaven. But this gives a really human portrayal of how it came about. And if we look at it like this can really open our eyes to so much of what the Bible is trying to tell us. Because if you look at it like this, you can see that every piece of it was put there for a reason. So the Bible wasn't given to us just to be some history book. If it was, it'd be a bad history book. It would skip out on details that we were really interested in, and it would include details that are really not important, don't really matter. Like, who cares about it? We read, okay, so Genesis 2, we're going to read, and you're going to be like tracking along, and you're going to see that there's a problem. There's no water. It's the opposite problem with Genesis 1 problem where there was too much water. Genesis 2, the problem there's no water. And then you're going to read, this whole long description about rivers. And, like, what is happening here? He makes the Garden of Eden, but then there's these rivers. And he goes into detail about 4 individual rivers. And how many of you have started your Bible reading? And you read through Genesis 1, and you're like, wow, that's really interesting. You read through Genesis 2. How many of you thought, like, what is up with all these rivers? And why do I need to know the names of all of them? And why is this whole thing about rivers here? And so it's a bit of a puzzle for us to discover. And we're going to discover that. And we're going to learn about why this whole random part about rivers shows up. All of it has to do with, okay, so it was arranged a certain way for us to learn something. Okay? There's the family quote. And then Louis Armstrong, a photo mosaic. These things are so cool. You can see that? This is a really cool technique. And it's something that the Bible's doing where you get a profile of Jesus. But then you have all these individual stories that you may not see Jesus in any individual one, but when you piece it all together, you see Jesus. Notice how with this, I don't know how many pictures there are, but you see what's going on here, right? You see how there's just hundreds of pictures maybe, and all the pictures put together create a profile, some larger picture. The Bible is working like that, where there's just story after story after story, poem after poem after poem, and they have meaning by themselves, but what you can do is you can string them together, and you can organize them in bundles, and you can see where they point to something else, whether it's one piece of the puzzle, or as you string them all together, you can see it gives a clear portrait of who Jesus is. So again, we want to read each individual story and see what is the Bible telling us, what are the authors trying to speak to us, what's God trying to speak to us through those individual stories. But then it's also, well, what do all these stories do? How do they give a bigger picture? So we're constantly zooming in and we're zooming out. I think for the Bible it's a little more sophisticated than this, because what you can really do is this gives two layers, right? You get the one picture and then you get another picture, but what if like each one of those individual pictures were made up by 1,000 smaller pictures? And each one of those were made up by 1,000 smaller pictures. I think with the Bible, you actually have multiple layers you can go down. So we can look at Genesis and say, what's the message of the book of Genesis? But then we can look at Genesis 2 and 3 and say, what's the message of Genesis 2 and 3? But then we can say, well, what's the message of Genesis 2? And then we can say, well, what's the message of these 3 verses? What's the message of this one verse? And then you can say, then you can do some cool things, because then you can say, well, what do these verses have to do with these verses? And these form a pattern here. It's called literary units. It's how we can break down what the text that we're reading into different parts. And the Bible is just so sophisticated and brilliant. I tell you, it's something like this you look at, and this next one that we're going to show, this next one, you show this and you can see why the Bible has been studied for thousands of years and why it has captured the imagination of people for so long and changed lives. I think what I pray for is that there would be a renewal and a revival of people coming to know Jesus, becoming Christians, because they are so drawn to the story of the Bible, just a new love for the Bible, not for its own sake, but that the literature would speak to the beauty of God himself. Here's the last image for you. Lord of the Rings. I admit, I talked to Richard, he was telling me different things about Lord of the Rings, the trees that they would ride. Oh man, I don't remember much about Lord of the Rings, but I do remember one thing. There was a ring. How many of you guys know that much about Lord of the Rings? There was a ring. And so how it's designed is that there's these different scenes that are meant to be put next to each other, where a character is tempted by the ring. And each character responds slightly differently. And so, good literature will include themes that repeat, but have little differences to help us learn and remember and consider things in different ways. And so one of the best ways you can read the Bible is to you read a story and you ask the question, where have I seen this before? So we read for our call to worship, we read these different cycles. You can kind of look at on your bulletin. These different cycles, you see a theme showing up again and again. You see a theme popping up, this whole be fruitful and multiply. This God-giving life and blessing shows up again and again. But the thing is about these themes is it's far more thought through than just here's a theme thrown out there. It's actually set up at a certain time that there's a cycle that you anticipate. Okay, you know what? There was just a flood. I think we should be looking out for a blessing coming up. It's really, really fascinating. And it's something that, if you've read the Bible over and over again, you might be like, how did I not see this before? Because it's all over the place. And that's where we're going to go next week. So next week what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what Tim Mackey calls the melody of the Bible. The melody. That there is a certain cycle that's on repeat over and over and over again. And that's going to help us understand the whole rest of Genesis, and really the whole rest of the Bible is seeing where are we at in the melody. So that's next week. Again, just to show you one more time, we've got the Mona Lisa, and we talk about what was the author's intent for what was written. We've got the family quilt to remind us of how it was arranged. We've got the photo mosaic to remind us of the literary units and to zoom in and zoom out. And then we've got the Lord of the Rings to remind us of the different themes that keep showing up. And every time we see this theme, we're looking a little differently at the nature of God and the nature of what it means to be human. We're asking really important, really complex questions, and the Bible answers them in really, really sophisticated ways. So Father God, we pray that you would open our eyes